Well, thank you very much for this. I mean, when I was thinking about what I should say when I started speaking here, I was really struck by the contrast. I mean, normally, I give a lot of lectures, but normally it's like calculus or statistics 101. And I can tell you, they never have to put an extra row of seats in the front so the students can come in, or tell people, there's not enough places to sit. That just never happens at all. So this is really fantastic. And I've just been hanging backstage with my warm-up band. I mean, I'm not sure that happens to many mathematicians. And so I first thought, I should emphasize that, but then I thought a little bit more about it, and to be honest, this is what mathematics should all be about. I just want to do this, where, let's have a big applaud for mathematics. Whey! Oh, fantastic. I'm going to try that with my students on Monday morning, and it's not going to work. But I had an idea that I wanted to start this talk with, and I think a lot of talking to many of you people, having such a big audience today, captures this idea, because for me, personally, being an applied mathematician has never really been about calculating things. I was quite good at, I can't say that I wasn't. Lots of people say to me, whenever I introduce myself as a mathematician, the first thing people say to me is, oh, I was no good at maths at school. Or they might tell me how brilliant they were. But I think 95% of people say, oh, I was no good at maths at school, as if they have to explain that to me. I'm not sure why I need to have that. I was saying if I was with the band, when they come off, I don't say to them, oh, I was no good at music at school. But we all feel we have to talk about our level of mathematics. But I wasn't an amazing mathematician from a young age, and I'm still not extremely good at calculating things. But I don't think that that's really what mathematics is about. What mathematics is about is trying to find new ways of thinking about the patterns in our lives. And it really is also about being adventurous. So my career as a mathematician has not been about making calculations alone. It's been about working together with other scientists to try and understand the world. And when I started my PhD, I started working on trying to understand honeybees. And honeybees isn't something you associate with mathematics, but we were interested. They're very organized creatures. They're much more organized than human beings are. They keep everything clean. They organize their work. They get on with everything. And we were interested in how they had that level of organization, and we build mathematical models to explain them. And then I went on and I worked with ants. So ant behavior, looking at how they form the trails, and they made all these beautiful patterns. Then fish schools and the movement of fish schools, bird flocks. I also looked at human behavior. I'm going to come back to a few aspects of human behavior which can be captured from mathematics. But all of those problems, they involved me as a mathematician working with other people and trying to understand their problems and just sharpen up their way of thinking a little bit by also using a bit of mathematics. And more recently, I've been doing exactly the same thing in football. So I work with leading football clubs, trying to help them sign players and also organize their team and look at the structure of their team. Football players, they're a bit more interesting than fish, I think. So they're not as interesting as honeybees. Honeybees are probably the most interesting. But what I get the chance to do as an applied mathematician is work with so many different types of people in order to understand how the world works in a whole variety of different ways. And so what I'm going to talk about this evening is 4 of those ways which I think everybody can learn something from. And the first of those ways is statistical. So the statistical way of thinking about the world, I think that's often the thing that comes into our mind first when we think of mathematics. But statistics is really only about 100 years old as a subject, and it really started with this character on the left. This is Ronald Fisher. There was a few other statisticians about the time, but he stood out. And this is a picture taken at Rothamsted, which was a research institute that he worked at. And he was also a bit like me, that he was very fascinated in trying to understand people's practical problems. He did his undergraduate degree at Cambridge, but he didn't like the other mathematicians. He thought they were too theoretical, and he wanted to go off and try and understand the world using statistics. And so he got a job at Rothamsted. He found it difficult to get a job at first because nobody really understood. He was a bit, well, we're going to come to, he was quite an arrogant person. He really believed a lot in himself. And he found it hard to get a job. But he did get recruited to Rothamsted because they were opening up to recruiting scientists with lots and lots of different backgrounds. And they even went so far as to decide they were going to have some women scientists at Rothamsted at the same time. And the head of Rothamsted, he said, well, I'm not sure, we've got these women scientists coming. I really don't know what to do with them. But I've thought of one thing, that women, they really need to have tea. I think women like to have a cup of tea. So what I've done is I've organized that we're going to we'll all have tea together. And so they organized for all of the scientists to start having a regular tea break. And Fisher, he would also, this is him, this is actually at the tea break. They'd be outside sometimes. And there was one day that one of the female scientists, Fisher was about to serve her some tea. And she said, stop, I don't want the tea. I always have my milk first. And Fisher got very angry about this. He said, oh, that's just ridiculous. I know everything about milk and tea. It doesn't matter which order you have your milk and your tea. It doesn't matter at all. And he said that she couldn't possibly taste the difference. And being the kind of arrogant, sort of, pedantic experimentalist that he was, he insisted that they set up an experiment to test if she could really tell the difference between having milk first or not having milk first. And I'm going to give you a bit of a challenge here. You're not going to get away. There's thousands of you come here tonight. You're going to have to solve a couple of math problems while you're here. So I'm going to give you a challenge first. How can we best test if Dr. Muriel Bristol can detect milk before tea using 8 cups? So the idea here is that we're going to place out 8 cups, and she has to tell the difference. If she can tell the difference, she should know which of them have had the milk in first and which of them had the tea in first. And we've got 2 different experimental setups. Experimental setup 1 is to offer a pairwise challenge. So what I'll do in the pairwise challenge is I'll come out with 2 cups of tea, one that I've put milk in first, one that I've put tea in first, and then I'll challenge her to taste the difference of that. Then I'll come out with another pair, and another pair. And so she'll test each of those in order. Test number 2, I'll make a whole tray with 4 with milk first and 4 with tea first. And then she has to pick out the ones that are the milk first. And then another option you can have as an audience here is there's no difference between these methods. So if you've got the 2 methods, do you think there's a difference between them, or is there no difference between them? Which of these is going to be the best experimental setup? So I'll have hands up. I have to come closer so I can see you all. Now I can see you all. Hands, and you have to put your hand up. This is what I do with my students, actually. Everybody has to, or you push the clicker or you put your hand up. So everybody has to put your hand up. So hand up for option A. Who thinks that option A will be? Okay, and then I think actually we'll do this cheering thing again. Cheer for option A. Okay, good. We've got a good cheer for option A. Okay, and option B. Put your hand up for option B. Whoa. We've got a lot of option Bs there. And option C, hand up for option C. Can it really make any difference how you do it? Well done. I think option B has won the vote here. And, well, we'll have a look at them. We'll have a look at option A first. And this is the way to see it. And this is what Fisher realized. What he thought about is this. What is the chance of her doing it if she's, or what's the chance of her lucking out and managing to guess right, even though she can't tell the difference? And what you can see here is if I do them in pairs, so one with tea and one without, one with milk first, one without milk first, and so on, there are 16 different ways that I can organize those cups. And that's 2 to the power of 14, because it's, 2 to the power of 4, because it's 2 different cups, and to the power of 4 because there's 4 pairs, which is 16. So there's 16 possible ways. And the probability of Dr. Muriel Bristol getting all 4 right, if she can't tell the difference, is 1 in 16. That's the only chance of her doing it. And now we're going over to the one that there was a big cheer for, option B. Now, option B, this is all the different ways. I got a bit bored writing them all out. This is why mathematics is so great, because you can actually calculate it. You don't have to sit and write them all out. But if you write them all out systematically, there might be all 4 tea first there and all first milk first, and so on. You rearrange them, and you find there's 70 different ways of arranging them. And the maths tells you this because there's 8 places to put the first cup, 7 to put the second cup, 6 and so on, and 5 for the 4th cup. So that's all of the different ways. But then the milk cups are not unique. So you divide by all the different unique ways you can put down a milk cup, and you end up with this sum of 70 different ways. And that means that the probability that Muriel Bristol can tell the difference in this experimental setup is just 1 in 70. So a big round of applause for everybody in Group B who got this correct. Well done. And what I think the big win here, or the big experimental idea that Fisher had, was this idea that randomness, the more random something is, the harder it is for us to beat that by chance. And so he went on to do a lot of work on experimental design, which we still use today. So all of these randomized experimental designs that we use in medical studies all originated from this idea of how you test T. And this, he wrote it himself in this first version of the book about statistical testing, that this testing T experiment was the way that he came up with these randomized designs. And I think I use statistical knowledge all the time, and this photograph, I think maybe I've just got this in because I want to kind of put in a picture of me together with Gary Neville and feel very good about it. So, but I like this story because I did a TV thing with Gary Neville, and he's of course like the real football man. And he says, oh, you know, he says he was interested in statistics in football and so on. But he also says, you know, there's just some things you can't measure with numbers. He said, for example, if you watch a player and their team goes a goal down, and then you see their head go down and you see they stop playing, and you can't measure that with numbers. You can't measure the attitude of a player with numbers. And I was sitting listening to him, and I was thinking, but that's exactly what you can measure with numbers. If your team goes a goal down, that's a statistical point, and you can look to see how did you perform when your team goes a goal down, and how did you perform when your team didn't go a goal down. That's something that you can test. And we built something. I have a football company that works with football and AI. We built something we called the Gary Neville metric. Just to kind of wind him up, I suppose. I sent it to him afterwards, and he was very good-natured about it. But the Gary Neville metric does this. So this is a match where Trent Alexander-Arnold, he's playing for Liverpool against Manchester United, and they go a goal, they've already gone 1 goal down, they go 2 goals down. And you can see the performance of the player in terms of the quality of the passes he was making, the chances he had on goal. And 15 minutes before the goal was scored, his performance is going up. And then 15 minutes after, his performance is going down. And you can measure for every player how their performance is 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after the goal. They have no way of knowing, of course, if a goal is coming. So it's reasonably fair experimental test. And we use that to identify who were the top Gary Neville players. And for the season we looked at, it turned out, and this, I suppose this might confirm many of our prejudices, Jamie Vardy is like a very determined character. And it turned out that he was better when his team went a goal down. They went down a goal down quite often, actually. But when they went a goal down, he got better 29 times, and he got worse 13 times, and was relatively the same 5 times. Ronaldo, who is always kind of gets his criticism for being a prima donna and so on, he also is one of these Gary Neville attitude players. His head might go down, he might look extremely grumpy, but his performances get better after his team goes a goal down. So statistics can't explain everything, but there's so many questions that we can, by breaking it down, looking at the numbers, we can get a deeper understanding of things, even if it's an understanding of something like attitude or our commitment to doing something. And that brings me on to the next study, because we're going to have 4 ways of thinking, 4 different mathematical ways of thinking today. So I want to start moving towards the downside and the limitations of statistics. And it starts with something that we might see as an upside. And this, one time I sat and watched all of the 25 top TED Talks in order to try and understand the statistics were used and the effect of their use. And you get very motivated by listening to them, and they always say things like this. It seems that the TED Talks that get very popular, they always say things like this, that if you're determined, if you follow through on your goals, you'll become more successful in life, and so on. So everyone becomes very motivated when they listen to these. And I don't want to say that that's not true, but I do want to look into the details of these studies. So this was one of them. This was one of the talks by Angela Duckworth. And she was talking about how grit, how being determined allows us to succeed. And she gave a TED Talk about it, which I think 30 million people have watched. And she also wrote an article about it. But the article has a slightly different message than you might think from the headline of the TED Talk. So if you read very carefully the abstract here, so grit explains 4% of the variance in success of outcomes. So that's 4% of the variance. Now, 4% of the variance, I think anyone can see that that's not very much. But just to give you an idea about what 4% of the variance looks like, it looks like this. So if I plot grit against grade point average, and this isn't data, I made up the data, but it has a variance of 4%, right? So the variance is 4% in this data. There is a statistical relationship. There's a slight trend from down here up to here. But up here, we have a person who has a grit personality score. They filled in the questionnaire, and they've got a grit personality score that's 5. And they've got a very high grade point average. So this really corresponds to the theory. And down here, we've got a person who's not very determined, and they've got a very low grit according to their personality, and they also got a very low grade point average. But you've also got this person up here, right? This person up here, she has very low determination. She says, I never see through anything I do. But she has a very high grade point average, so she's doing very well. And unfortunately, you have this person down here. And he says, I'm really determined, I'm going to work very hard. And then he gets a very, very low grade. And so all of those people can be part of that statistical pattern. And I think that I suppose that's maybe the second take-home. I want you to think about the power of statistics, but then I also want you to think, next time you see one of those newspaper headlines saying you'll get healthier if you do this, or you'll be happier if you do this, or you have to be determined to succeed, or so on, then just think a little bit about the data which the scientists are actually looking at. This is definitely enough to publish a scientific article. You can become a famous scientist publishing lots and lots of results of this type, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be true for me as an individual or for you as an individual. And this is also a lesson that really needed to be applied to Ronald Fisher, because I've said many positive things about Ronald Fisher, and he was an extremely successful scientist, but he was also problematic in very many ways. So he was a eugenicist. He believed that some people were inherently smarter than other people. He certainly put himself in that category of being inherently smarter than other people. And he believed that some people were less smart. And he believed that people who were cleverer should have more children so that we had smarter people in the future, and people who were less clever should have less children. And this, of course, is, this is a horrible thing, and it was before a lot of this research ended, thankfully, with Nazi Germany, because after that there was no discussion about these types of things in that way. And it was also, the point is, it's not just that it was a horrible thought, it was also wrong. It was statistically wrong. So it isn't the case, of course there is inheritance of course we have variability and we have inheritance of various traits, we know that, but IQ is not highly inheritable, and intelligence, in a broader sense, certainly isn't inheritable over generations in the way that it should be. But he stuck to this even when he could see that he was losing the argument. He came up with statistical arguments about why it should be true. He also, when he finally admitted that he got it wrong with that, he then started a campaign to prove that smoking didn't cause lung cancer. So it's just, I don't know what we learn from this, but one thing that we learn from it is even the very best statisticians can be blinded by their own belief in something. I think that, luckily, is why we need other ways of thinking. And so let's go to another way of thinking. So the next way of thinking is the interactive way of thinking. And for me, I see the interactive as being sort of the opposite of the statistical way, because it starts from the opposite direction. In the statistical way of thinking, what we do is we look at the data and we try to find relationships in that data. In the interactive way of thinking, we start by trying to work out how we think the world works. So we try and work out what are the rules of interaction between people or between animals, or if you're a physicist, between particles. We start by thinking about what those rules of interaction could be, and from there we try and build our mathematical model. And I see the roots of this lying with a different mathematician. This is Alfred Lotka, and he came up with an idea of explaining any kind of interaction in the same way as we explain chemical reactions. So if in school you'll have seen these, that 2H2 plus 2O2 goes to 2H2O. So we'd sit there and we'd balance those equations in school. Those types of chemical reactions we're used to. His idea was that our social interactions, animal interactions, all types of interactions could be explained in the same way. And he started by proposing the following equations. These are the they became later known as the Lotka-Volterra equations. Volterra was the biologist who later worked with them. And what he'd do here is, so this is for a population. So you knew you were going to come here and get some mathematics this evening. So you're ready. I've got the equations for you here. So there's an equation here for rabbits, and there's an equation here for foxes. And this equation, dr by dt, this is the rate of change of rabbits, and this is the rate of change of foxes. And we'll start with the way that Lochte wrote down his equation. He wrote them down like this. So he'd say that one rabbit becomes 2 rabbits. So do you have this in Danish that you say like multiplying like rabbits? Yeah, so this is the equation for multiplying like rabbits, that the rabbit population keeps growing. But there's also a fox equation. So the fox plus a rabbit becomes 2 foxes. Now, that might not be something you've seen in your biology lessons. It's not exactly like that, but the idea is that the more rabbits the foxes have, the quicker they're able to reproduce. So it's an abstraction away from it. And a lot of interactive thinking is like that. It's not always about saying things that are totally 100% true. It's just trying to work out what's the underlying mechanism which explains that. And so the foxes eat the rabbits, and then they become more foxes. So they become more foxes. This is also, the rabbits are going to be dying at this time too. So the rabbits disappear. There's no rabbits on the right-hand side of this equation, but there's 2 foxes on the right-hand side of this equation. And then finally, there's nothing, in this model, there's nothing that eats the foxes, but the foxes eventually die off anyway. And he took this equation and he started to look, well, what happens if I solve it? And these arrows point in the direction of change of the rabbits and the foxes. So when there's a lot of rabbits and very few foxes, the rabbits increase in number, and the foxes also increase in number. But once you have enough foxes, then the rabbits start to decrease because the foxes are enough to be eating them a lot, and the population goes down. And you see that you follow round and round and round, and he showed that you would get a circle. So you would get this continual circle of fox and rabbit populations. And this means if you looked at them over time, they'd go up. The rabbits would go up first, then the foxes would go up, the rabbits come down, and this cycle would continue forever. And so just by thinking about how foxes and rabbits might interact, he ended up coming with quite a novel prediction about how their populations would never stabilize and continue to oscillate going up and down forever. And those types of models, we use them everywhere now. They're a really important part of how we model, and I'm going to give an example now, for example, how we model epidemics. So you've probably all been through the pandemic. Yes, you've all been through the pandemic. And you'll have probably all have heard the endless debates about the mathematical models predicting this thing and that thing. You know, I live in Sweden, so we had a very different approach to the pandemic than you did. And our mathematicians, they were very sure that they had the right approach to the pandemic. And your mathematicians were very sure that you had the right approach to the pandemic. So that doesn't really tell us anything positive about mathematicians, does it? But what we did all learn about was that mathematical models were a very important part of planning for the pandemic. And the mathematical equation for pandemics is as following. You start with the S's, the susceptible individuals. Then, if you're not careful, oh yeah, the infective one is over there. Sorry, I couldn't resist. There's an infective one. And then suddenly there's 2 infective ones. And this continues. They meet more susceptible ones, and there's a lot and lots of infective ones. And you start to see that climb. So you can model that type of interaction. And you can use this in lots of other settings. So we did a study of audience applause. So what we did is we put a group of 30 undergraduate students into a classroom. These were first-year undergraduate students. And we then put a third-year undergraduate student who should present for the first-year undergraduate students something from their research project. And we said to the first-year undergraduate students, remember to give them a round of applause after they finish. But what they didn't know is they knew they were part of a study, but what they didn't know is we were filming them to find out how they applauded. And we found that they applaud in the same way as a disease spread through a population. So they had exactly this reaction to each other. One person starts applauding, and then the other person is, oh, yeah, I remember we had to applaud at the end of this. And then eventually it spreads through the whole group, and everyone's applauding. But the best bit, yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. That has never happened before. Really good, thank you. But were you paying attention to how you stopped applauding now? Because the best bit was the same reaction is how you stop applauding. So when you probably thought, yeah, we've got to give him a bit of an applause now because he said this funny thing or whatever. But you've probably also thought, well, when can we stop? And the rule you were using was you were looking around, oh yeah, the person's next to me, it seems to be getting a bit quieter, I'll stop as well. Because it's exactly the same rule. So the people who are infected with the applaud, they meet or they encounter the recovered people, and they also recover from the applause. And I like to think of this as well. So if you have given a little seminar at work or whatever, and people are applauding for quite a long time, it might not be because they liked what you said. It might just be they're not very coordinated and couldn't manage to get this function working properly. So do bear that in mind. And this type of approach is useful in all different settings. This is an experiment. If I hop back to fish, this is an experiment we did. If you look carefully in this plot, this is a predator, which is a big fish, we'll say. And I'm going to let some little fish come swimming along here. Now, don't worry, no fish got harmed in this experiment. It's just it's a plastic predator. So it's not going to eat any of the fish, but the fish are going to come swimming along here. And we're interested, can they spot the predator? I'll start this off here. So there's our predator is up there. These are our fish, they're mosquito fish. And we've got the task in front of them. And first we'll start with one little fish. Remember, the predator's on the right. Oh, looking nervous. Oh. Went past the predator. But, yeah, oh, that's the action replay. I forgot about that. And now here come the group. And they're all going to swim along and try and do the same thing. Coming up to the junction. And you see all of them except one changed their mind. Went back the other way. And there's two things I want to emphasize about that experiment. One is how the group, we did this experiment lots of times, and for an individual fish, they will choose the right path, which doesn't go past the predator. They'll choose it only they'll choose that 54% of times. And they'll make the wrong choice 46% of times. While a large group of fish, they will make the correct choice 90% of times, and only 10% of times they'll swim past the predator. When they do get it wrong, they all go past the predator, right? So they all get it wrong together. But normally they'll manage to make the right choice. So larger groups are better at this decision making, and that's because they copy each other. So we often think of this idea of herding and following each other as being some sort of stupid, moronic behavior. But it's not like that at all. If you keep an eye on the individuals around you, and one of them has some good piece of information, that piece of information will flow to all of the group. Well, that works for fish. I can't guarantee it works for humans, but it works for fish anyway. And the second thing I want to point out was, if you notice there was one fish that made a mistake, but the other fish, who still had an option after the one fish had made a mistake, they ignored that fish and they continued to go down the right thing. And we found that there was this very clear rule about two fish. If one fish makes a mistake, the rest of the shoal will ignore it. But if two fish start to make a mistake, then you'll start to see a flow of all of the fish following those two fish. So this kind of rule that, one person can get something wrong, but two very seldom get something wrong, that is a solid rule to use, or is a solid rule that the fish use in their decision making. And I think it's also something that we can use as individuals. If you see one person making a mistake, probably not a good idea to imitate them. But if you start to see two or larger groups making a mistake or doing something, then it's probably a better idea to follow them. So those types of interactive, I met a guy in the bar immediately, and I do a lot of talks about football. And he came up and he said, "Oh, I've watched all of your YouTube videos about football. What are you going to be talking about tonight?" I feel very sorry for this guy now. But what are you going to be talking about tonight? Because, I've watched, it'll probably be a bit of a summary of this and a bit of a summary of that. And I said, "Well, I'm not really going to be talking that much about football." And he looked very disappointed. So this is for him. So we have got some football here. And this is very much how we model football. We use very much the same tools for modeling fish as football. And that's not meant to be funny. To me, that's obvious. You can talk to football players and tell them what they're doing wrong, and you can't do that with fish. And football players do listen a little bit more often than fish do to the advice you give them. So it is good working with football players. And what I want to show here is one of the many ways in which we can model football. But what we do here is we're interested in looking. This is a pass to Marcus Rashford. And if you look carefully at how that pass is received, he has to slow down ever so slightly to receive it. And the sort of thing that we can do with this interactive style of mathematics is we can model what is the best pass for a player to make. And so this red area would be the best pass for them to make. And we can manage to evaluate, where we have to use a lot of this in scouting, or we use a lot of this in scouting players, and you can measure the space that players are opening up for runs using this type of approach. This is another example of the same thing. And in this example, we're looking at Luke Shaw here. He runs out here on the edge, and he opens up space for his teammates. And so a lot of the way that we study football is about picking apart the details of how those interactions of the players create the game as a whole. And I think that I wanted to give an example of that. I'm going to move on to another topic of mathematics. And this one is particularly dear to my heart because I'm quite a chaotic person. I don't know if I'm more chaotic than the average person, but I'm a pretty chaotic person. I find it difficult to organize my life because I just get totally fascinated in honeybees, totally fascinated in ants, then football players, and then I just really get focused on that at cost of other things, including often my family around me who wonder why I'm so obsessed with this particular thing or that particular thing. And I think that chaos is a big dominating force in my life. But chaos does not have to be a dominating force in your life if you're a mathematician. This is Margaret Hamilton. She was a mathematician by training, and then she became one of the first computer programmers. And she went to MIT to work on the first simulations of the weather. This was the computer that she had. She loved this ENIAC computing machine. They'd fill in punch tape into it, and they'd get results out of it. And she hated making mistakes. There was nothing that she hated more than getting something wrong. She was definitely not a chaotic person. And her project was to simulate the weather. And so she had 14 differential equations. We've already seen 2 differential equations for the rabbits and the foxes. She had this system of 14 differential equations that she was simulating. And she put them on to simulate overnight. And she came back in the morning, and she'd got a different result than the one she'd expected. She'd ran exactly the same simulation before, and now she'd got a completely different result. And they went through everything. This really pained her because she liked everything to be so correct. And they couldn't find the difference. But then eventually they found not an error in her code, but what they found was that they'd fed in the initial conditions to 4 decimal places the first time they'd done the simulation. Then they'd filled it in to 6 decimal places the second time they'd done the simulation. And it was the difference in that 5th decimal place that made a difference to the outcome of her simulation. And with that moment, she discovered what we now call chaos. She found a small difference in the simulation led to a very large difference at the end of the simulation. And that became known as the professor who she was working with, who was the weather biologist, Edward Lorenz. He later talked about the butterfly of chaos. And they made this figure which illustrated it. So you see the movement here. This is the idea of there's a weather system here, and this is the dynamics of that weather system. And it never repeats, it goes round, and 2 points that are very close to each other in these dynamics will eventually move very far apart. And what we're going to do tonight, so it's not enough to talk about chaos, we are now going to experience some chaos. So I need a volunteer. Can I have a volunteer from the audience? Oh, I got a very fast volunteer here. Oh, yes, and applause for the volunteer. Yeah, no, come up. Yeah. I don't know how I think you might have to go that way. Can you? Yeah, I hadn't planned this, but I think you have to go around the other side, I'm afraid. Oh. Oh, okay. Are you okay? Well, big applaud for the volunteer. And while she's volunteering, you can't have a break here. You have to read what you're going to do, because we're going to do the voluntary thing now, or we're going to do an example, and then you're going to do the same exercise together. So have a look up here what we're going to do. And you, what's your name?
Joyce.
Joyce, very nice to meet you, Joyce. Now, you haven't had a time to read the thing because you've been walking up here. But we're going to do the following thing. I'm going to think of a number between 1 and 99. Then I'm going to say that number to you. You are going to double that number if it's less than 50. If it's more than 50, you're going to take it away from 100. You're following all this? You're going to take it away from 100, and then you're going to double it. It's okay, I'll help you. We'll do an example. So this is for you all to get this example. And I've even written up my example here. So I'm going to say the number 42 to you, because that's all you always use 42. So you say 84, and I take 84, and I've done the calculation. I said I was no good at calculation, so I have to check my notes here. Oh, yes, 84. 100 minus 84, that must be, all right, great. I meant to do that bit. So it's 16. And then I double it, it's 32, and I say to you 32. 64, great. And so I take the 64, 100 minus 64 is 36, double it, 72.
And then 28.
Times 2, 28 times 2, you have 56. Okay? So if you all got that, what you're now going to do, you're going to turn to the person next to you. Hopefully you might meet someone new, or it might be the person you came with. And you're going to play this game together and no cheating at the back. You've all got to do this now, please. So everybody is going to play this game and do the numbers together.
It's a bar example.
Yeah, okay. No, well done. That's very nice. You've read the book. Huh? You've read the book then. Okay. Okay. So you can't see very much. You can't see very much when you're up here. It's very...
No, they check out the drinks.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm not sure if I'm hearing the murmur of numbers being said backwards and forwards, or just a confused murmur of what is he asking us to do. But okay, we'll stop there. Now I know you don't listen to me any more than my students do, so we'll stop now. Yeah, applause. And we'll do an applause here for Joyce. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much. Now, let me just give an example here, because the idea I want to illustrate is chaos. And if you take two close together numbers, so maybe someone over there started with 13 and someone over there started with 14, I think probably we'll have taken all the numbers out of these. So, and if you did 13, you said 26, 52, 96, 8, 16, 32, 64. If you started with 14, you got the following sequence. And you can see that these two sequences, they start very, very close together. But suddenly when you get to this 88, you get 24, 48, and you start to diverge, and you start to go in different directions. So what has happened there is you have a sensitivity to initial conditions. Just like in the weather simulation, you started with two numbers very close together, and very quickly they diverge. In this case, because they're integers, you will end up going in a cycle backwards and forwards, but it will be a very kind of jumpy cycle. I won't say it's chaotic, but it's a jumpy cycle. But if I listen to, so over here there's someone starting with 13. Over here there's someone starting with 14. But overall, all that I can hear from up here is a bunch of random numbers, because this sequence is just generating more and more random sounding numbers. They're all even numbers, but they're basically random numbers that are being generated. And this pattern gets even worse if you think about, or even more spectacular if you start with very small differences. So here's 14.1. I didn't allow you to use, I don't know, did anyone use non-decimal numbers when they chose their number between 1 and 99? No? No one thought of that. You do realize there's a lot more numbers between 1 and 99 than the integers. In fact, there's infinitely many more. There's uncountably many more. So I don't know how you got mixed up and used an integer. But I decided not to use an integer. And if I start with 14.1 and 14.2, they start very close together, but they also diverge. And I do this for 20 times, and they're completely disconnected random numbers. And we often illustrate it like this. We call this a cobweb diagram. And the idea is that you take the previous number, you go up to your next number, you go back to the line, and then you go up to this line. So I if I start with 20, I go to 40, 40 to 80, 80 goes back to 40, and I keep going around like that. But if I don't take one of these periodic integers, I end up oscillating round and round and round, and eventually I just fill up this entire cobweb with numbers. And that is why chaos is unavoidable. I mean, if you think about the process we were doing there, is such a simple process. I mean, it takes a little minute to learn, but Joyce mastered it very quickly, and we could actually see that we ended up generating chaotic random numbers. And I like to connect this because from her discovering or working on the beginnings of chaos, Margaret Hamilton actually went on to another job. And she went on to work for NASA and wrote the software for the system that was on the Apollo landing mission. And so she was responsible for making sure that there was no possible error in the moon landing. And I think for somebody who discovered chaos, I'm not sure that this is what motivated her, but I can think it's very important to really understand how easy it is to produce chaos if you're going to run something like the moon landing. There's lots of chaos can be produced from the thrusters and so on inside controlling a spaceship. But she wrote software that was safety critical, that would pick up any potential problem. And there was actually a problem just as they were descending to the moon. These alarms started going off, saying that the thrusters were not working properly. And her software actually kicked in and saved the moon landing. And so she was rewarded afterwards for an amazing effort with her, with this software. I feel I want to have, because I've only got the opportunity to do this, let's have an applaud for Margaret Hamilton. And okay. Thanks very much. And I see very much similar things in football as well. So I am going back to football again. I think I can't stay away from it. And in football, you have exactly that thing that you have to be able to deal with randomness. Because although there's a lot of precision in the way that you make a pass, there's also an incredible amount of randomness in football. I often use this graph here. This is to illustrate the Poisson distribution. Poisson distribution, really, it describes when events happen randomly in space and time, and goals happen randomly in a football match. And so if you want to know the distribution of how many goals you'll have in a football match, it's almost perfectly Poisson distributed. So we always have these stories about how a particular team won the match or why that thing happened. But underlying all of those more complicated stories, we have this randomness, which, actually underlying it, explaining the outcome of many football matches is just a case of referring back to randomness. We can't really control the results to such a great degree. And I use a lot of that thinking in my own life. I mentioned before that I tend to be a bit more of a chaotic person. And my wife, she has to put up with me, and she's much more of an orderly person. And she thinks much more in this kind of interactive, ordering type way. And I always kind of make excuses for why things have gone wrong, that there was this randomness and so on. And I'm not sure that I'm the right person to give relationship advice, but I do think that it might be you who's the more orderly person in the relationship, or it might be you who's the more random person. But I think it's a very helpful way of thinking about our relationships and the differences between us. In one way, we should think about how in Margaret Hamilton's first experiment, she just couldn't control the randomness in that case. There's lots of ways in which we just have to let go and realize that there is always going to be randomness in our lives. So if you're a very orderly person, I think it's very useful to think about that aspect, that you always have to understand that whatever you control, there's always going to be that randomness. But equally, if you're a more chaotic-minded person, it's important to understand the other thing that Margaret Hamilton did, landing on the moon, that if something is really important to you, and I can say that my wife is very important to me and my family is very important to me, you make sure that you do the steps, you take control of things so that things will actually work out. So we try to have this idea that certain things we just let go and they become a little bit more random, like the laundry not getting done. Just now our washing machine's broken, actually, so laundry not getting done. But then there's other things, like sitting down for dinner together each evening, that we make sure that we keep organized, and we do. So I think it's very much about finding this yin and yang. The yin is the disorder, and the yang is the order. And we have now gone through 3 ways of thinking. I was promised there would be a timer, but I had to remember, this is where I'm chaotic. I had to remember what the time was when I came up. That would have helped. But so I think, and I do want to leave some questions for time for questions as well. But I'm going to leave with complex thinking. And complex thinking is a massive subject, and I want to give a few simple reflections on it. So I want to start with something that we call a cellular automata model. Cellular automata models are very useful for explaining how local, simple interactions can create very complicated patterns. So there's, in each of the, this is a cell, or this is an array of cells, and they only interact with the cells next to them. So it's a 200 by 200 array of cells. And so each of these dark blue, light blue, or white cells are only interacting very closely to those nearby. And the rules are as follows. The white ones, we're going to call them bone. These become goo, dark blue, if less than 4 of their neighbors are bone. Otherwise, they remain bone. The goo ones, which are the dark blue, these become what I call fluid, light blue, if less than 3 of their neighbors are bone. And the light blue ones, these become white if 2 or more of their neighbors are bone. Now, the particular rules aren't that important. You can have different rules which do similar things. But what I think is the amazing thing is that from those simple rules for how cells interact with each other, we get the most complicated structures, both in this kind of flow, and this is why I called them goo and fluid, because you have this flowing goo, and then you also have these more solid structures that are building and connecting up, or trying to build and then going backwards and forwards. And it's very difficult to believe that these simple rules are producing such complex patterns, but they are. And that has been taken to an extreme. There's this beautiful trend I've seen on Twitter, because Twitter, well, of course, Twitter's gone now and it's X, and I haven't seen this for a while either, but on, a group of people took this challenge of writing computer code in 244 characters of Twitter, which would produce the most beautiful and complex patterns possible. So they wrote graphics code, 244 characters, which produced this figure. And so this is based on a kind of fractal-like pattern with different coloring and shading schemes. And you can produce things like this, and they all have this beautiful biological form, all from a very, very short piece of computer code. And that type of approach underlay a lot of the way that we approached modeling animal behavior. We always thought about interactions between people. This is the applause study I've talked about. This is larger clouds. This is locusts. This was when we experimented on all sorts of animals. This is the famous prawns in a bucket experiment that we did. Didn't get as much media attention as some of the other things, but it was one of our absolute favorites. We filmed loads and loads of prawns in a bucket, and then we studied how these prawns moved around in a bucket. And no one knew why we were doing it, but we did it for a long time, and we know everything. We totally modeled prawns. So if you want to know anything about prawns afterwards, we've got an article about the prawns, what happens when you put prawns in a bucket. Anyway, I've spent a lot of time, and we had lots of other studies, but it always came back to this idea of simple interactions between these animals would produce the most complicated patterns. And that's what I want to leave you with regard to complexity, because I'm going to leave you with a theory of Andrei Kolmogorov, the mathematician. And his theory was the following, that a pattern is as complex as the length of the shortest description that can be used to produce it. And I think one way we can think of this in our own lives, I think we can think of it in 2 ways. The first way we can think about it is that we live in this very, very complex world, and we want to be able to use tools like mathematics to reduce and to understand. And that's what we should always be trying to do. We should be taking the complexity around us and trying to understand it in simple explanations which summarize what we're thinking. And this was very much Kolmogorov's ambition. But Kolmogorov, he also found another thing. He found that most strings of data, he was working and studying strings of data, they couldn't be reduced. He found that most often, the simplest or the shortest explanation for anything is the thing itself. There is no way of reducing our complexity down to a simpler level. So while I think we should try and understand the world better, we should also bear in mind what Kolmogorov taught us about complexity. In the end, there is no way of reducing this infinite complexity in our lives down to a single string. And I think that's a nice point to leave us on. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I don't think I'll ever be a rock star again. So I'm going to walk off. You can applaud, and then. Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good evening.